Hello photography family, Todd Peak of Peak Photography, and I hope you're enjoying this beautiful day. I'm so excited for today's video as we look at the third and final element of our exposure triangle series. We looked at shutter speed a few weeks ago. Last week we learned about ISO, so today, aperture. This is one of the most dramatic and fun elements of the exposure triangle, but if not used correctly, it can lead to some pretty big mistakes. So let's dig into this final video of the exposure triangle series and see what the aperture and the f-stop are all about. So come on, let's learn together. This week I went to the Barker farm and shot some really cool pictures with focus on aperture. Stick with me to the end of the video to see the entire collection of the images from that night, but before we get there, we have to understand what aperture, also known as f-stop, what it really is. So this is much simpler than you may realize. The aperture is defined as an opening through which light travels. Yep, that's it. That's the definition. Now, I know it's not that easy when it comes to photography, but it's really important that we understand what the aperture is. As always, there are much more technical and complex videos on aperture, but I want to keep this as simple as possible. Here's an image of a lens at different f-stops. As you can see, the lower the number, the wider the opening. This allows more light into the image and creates a very shallow depth of field. But going from an f1.4 to an f8, you can see how much smaller the opening is. This allows less light into the image. Now this also creates much deeper depth of field along with much more depth to be in focus through the image. Now I think the amount of light is pretty easy for us to understand, so let's look at the depth of field. Now in this image you can see clearly what depth of field means. The image is with a very shallow depth of field. The area in focus is really small. The item in front of and behind the focal point are both out of focus. If this image had been taken at an aperture of f22, all of the text would have been in focus. Now, here in Bristol, we have this awesome mural that I love to take pictures at. You know, Bristol, Tennessee is the birthplace of country music, so this mural is very fitting. You can see in this series of images how the trees in the background go from in focus at an f11 to blurred out with a shallow f-stop of 1.4. Now this blurred out part of the image is often referred to as bokeh. Bokeh is defined as the way the camera renders the out of focus points of light. And come on, let's be honest, it's just fun to say. But this is a boring way to see this in action. This week we went out to the Barker farm. I spent some time vlogging while we shot a few images. Teresa Barker and Alexa were our models, and they both did an amazing job. And as you'll be able to tell pretty quickly, we didn't light this video for production quality, and it was freezing cold outside. But here's a look at the depth of field being explored on the shoot in real time. I'm going to drop my aperture all the way down to an f1.4. f1.4 is going to be a very shallow depth of field. It's going to be a lot of bokeh in the background, so this is going to be one where we're going to be really precise with the focal point and make sure that we line this thing up exactly right. And then once we hit this one, there's going to be a very shallow depth of field, which means we're going to have to make sure the focus is right. So I'm going to take just a second and focus right in on the eye, make sure I've got that. We're going to hit it, and then I'm going to take the aperture a little bit wider and show you how the difference between the shallow depth of field and the longer depth of field puts more in focus there. So let's take it at 1.4. I'm going to really carefully make sure we've got this right on the eye. little bit more for composition. And right here as a 1, 2, and 3. All right, we're going to come from this side over here. Do the same thing. You can just look right at me. Really careful to make sure that when we set the aperture, we're making sure that our exposure is corrected through either the shutter speed or the ISO. Now, as you can see, when we close the aperture, we get more of the image in focus. But we have to account for those stops of light by increasing either our ISO or by slowing down our shutter speed, allowing more light into the image. This helps us to maintain the correct exposure. Now, here are a few more images that we were able to get before we froze. And since it was bitter cold in the barn, we moved inside for the remainder of the shoot. So let's look at how we continue to use the shallow depth of field for portraits and what happens when we adjust it in the focal depth. Now in this beautiful image of Alexa, the f-stop is set to f1.4. The shutter speed was at 1/60th of a second and the ISO was at 1250. Now this is such a shallow depth of field that it almost hurt us in this situation. It's really close to being so shallow that we have one eye in focus and the other eye out of focus because of the way her head is turned. Now check it out. As soon as I zoom in on the eye, you see that one is in focus, but by the time we get to the other eye, the eyelashes at the edge are out of focus. That's how shallow this depth of field is at f1.4. But when I move the f-stop to an f8, I had to take the shutter speed to 1/15th of a second and the ISO up to 6400. But you can see here her entire body is in focus, leaving the out of focus elements to the back of the image, creating the bokeh we see behind her. Now, and to show you the deeper depth of field, when I moved it to an f-stop of f16, I took my shutter speed to 1/30th of a second to eliminate any camera shake from pressing the shutter release, but I had to take my ISO to 20,000. You can see how much more of the background is in focus, but if you remember from last week's video, the extreme ISO causes a lot of noise in the image. So if I wanted to print this in a large format, it would have had way too much noise for it to be usable. But the depth of field in a wide open f-stop isn't only used for portraits. Sometimes you can use it to be creative, as we see in this video from inside the Barker home studio. We came inside, did a little bit of inside studio work, but still wanted to get a few pictures to show you some of the distinctions between the really shallow depth of field and the larger depth of field. So Teresa Barker's done some pictures with us, and she has a very lethal bow and arrow that scares me to death. But we did some pictures with her aiming the arrow directly at the camera, and I'll put those up now. You'll be able to see here where we did the pinpoint focus on the tip of the arrow, and she's blown out completely. This is at the f1.4 aperture range. And then you can see on this next one where the focus is more on Teresa's eye and blows out, of course, the arrow itself. So we just wanted to be able to show you that shallow depth of field and what that really looks like and how that changes as you adjust the aperture. So as you're adjusting the aperture yourself, just know that the lower the number, aperture 1.4, 3.2, 4.0, the lower the number, you're going to have to adjust for that because that is going to be a brighter picture. So you may have to adjust your shutter speed into a faster shutter speed to drop the exposure level. So to answer your question, yes, I did fear for my life when taking some of these pictures. But in all seriousness, no, I wasn't in danger in any way. But getting the tip of the arrow in focus was not easy. The shallow depth of field was so small that it kept trying to focus on Teresa's hand, right behind the tip of the arrow. I ended up having to manually focus on the arrow to lock the focus in. That's how shallow the depth of field was. I hope this video has given you a better understanding of the aperture and the f-stop, and that you'll be more confident shooting at different depths of field for your images. And if you've learned something today, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe to this channel for more tutorials. And just like this one, we've got a lot more on the way. As a matter of fact, I've got a special video in production right now about getting out of auto mode. So let's take what we've learned in these previous video series and put it into practice. So hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. But wait, don't leave yet. Just as promised, I'll conclude this video with the entire set of edited images from the shoot at the Barker farm and a video introducing all those who helped me in this session. Special thanks as always to my beautiful wife, Crystal, who grabbed the camera and took videos for me during this shoot at a moment's notice. Thanks to Adam and Teresa Barker for hosting us, and to Teresa Barker and Alexa for being our beautiful models for the evening. And a special thanks and shout out to Danny Dorsey and Danny Dorsey Photography, who was with us all night and helped me along the way. You all are awesome. Hey, thanks to everyone for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you, Teresa, for letting us take tonight. Danny Dorsey, Dorsey Photography, Danny Dorsey Photography, and even Adam Barker back there letting us come out and shoot tonight. Thank you guys very much. And Alexa, one of our beautiful models that was here tonight, you'll get to see some of her pictures that we did both here and in the barn. And we're just thankful that we were able to come out and do this tonight, even though it was freezing cold out there. I hope that you enjoyed it.